Thank you everyone for being here. So, as Rich mentioned, I'm a graduate research assistant at the Center for 21st Century Universities, and my home department is the School of Psychology, where I work with Richard Katrenbone. And today I'm going to be telling you about courses that mix face-to-face and online instructional methods, and how those methods are affecting student learning. So to give you some background, there's been a lot of interest in courses that mix face-to-face and online instructional methods in the past 15 or so years. And the term that I use to generally refer to these classes is mixed method courses, mostly because that's a term that hadn't been claimed before. But some of the terms that are commonly used are hybrid, blended, flipped are the most common. Inverted is somewhat commonly used, and then replacement and supplemental have also been used. And the reason that people are interested in these courses is because they have the potential to improve student learning. So if instructors are no longer limited by either giving face-to-face or online instructions, then they can use the methods that are most effective for teaching, whether it's online or face-to-face, and use both face-to-face and online instruction to reach students. The problem with this research is that the support for mixed methods research has been pretty inconsistent. There's a lot of research that suggests these mixed method courses improve learning, and there's also a lot of research that suggests they have no impact on learning outcomes. And so if you look a little bit closer into this research, you realize that these inconsistent results are due to inconsistent classifications of these terms. So I've seen examples of a course that was reported as blended and was, well, this is the real blended course, so we'll get to the other one. But the course had students watch lectures before coming to class, so introduce the content before coming to class, and then in class, they applied the content while the instructor was there to provide feedback. And so this is typically what you think of as a flipped course. They particularly called it blended. Another type of course that was reported as blended had students assigned to one of two classrooms. And on day one, the instructor would come into classroom A and give a live lecture while that lecture was streamed to classroom B in a live format. And then on day two, they would switch. So the instructor gave a live lecture in classroom B and streamed that lecture to classroom A. And so these two classes obviously use very different instructional methods, but they've both been classified as blended. And so these sorts of inconsistencies, they make it difficult to find themes in the research, because if you have these two very different types of classes that are called blended, it's hard to do a keyword search with blended and find anything that's really meaningful. It also makes it difficult to meaningfully discuss instructional methods. So if I'm talking to somebody and I say blended, assuming that they know what I mean, and their idea of blended is very different from my own, then we can't really have a productive conversation about it. And all of these things just make it difficult to advance research in this field. So to address this issue, we need definitive terminology that consistently defines what these terms mean so that we can move forward with knowledge in this field. So that's where the taxonomy comes in. So we made a taxonomy to define these terms consistently. And to start, I combed through all of the previous definitions of hybrid, blended, flipped, inverted that I could find, looking for common dimensions that people were using to define these terms. And I found 4 common dimensions. About half of the definitions talked about the instructional location, so where the students were learning, whether it was at home or in a classroom or in a coffee shop or something like that. The other half of the definitions talked about delivery medium. So how the students are getting instruction, whether it's from an instructor or from technology. And so digging a little deeper into these 2 dimensions, I found that they're really getting at the same sort of quality of instruction, which is how students are getting the instruction. And so I chose to include delivery medium in the taxonomy instead of instructional location because I think it's more prescriptive of the instructional experience that students get. So if students are watching a lecture on their computer, it's important that they can be wherever they want or watch it whenever they want or pause it at whatever time they want. It's not necessarily important if they're at home or in a classroom or in a coffee shop or something like that. So of these two dimensions, I included the delivery medium dimension. Another common dimension was instruction type. So whether instruction was sort of teacher-driven, sort of didactic lecture, or whether instruction was student-driven feedback and guidance and asking the instructor questions. And so this sort of gets at the passive versus active learning that's very common. And so I also included this dimension in the taxonomy. And the last dimension that was sometimes mentioned was synchronicity of instruction, so whether students followed a group pace or an individual pace. And there were a few that mentioned synchronicity, but I found that it wasn't independent from the delivery medium instruction. So if students are getting face-to-face instruction, it has to be synchronous. And in the case of mixed method courses, most of the time when students are getting online instruction, it's asynchronous. So this wasn't really independent from the delivery medium dimension at this point, but it's probably something that will be considered in the future as more of these studies are coming out. And so before I move on any further into the taxonomy, I want to say that it's aimed at instructional experiences. So it's only looking at learning experiences that have some sort of instruction for the students from an instructor or from an instructional program. And well, so for example, if students are discussing a topic in class with an instructor provide feedback or on a forum with an instructor that's moderating the forum, then that would be included in this taxonomy. But if students are walking down the street talking about something that they learned in class and there's no instructor to provide guidance or feedback in that case, then that's not included in the taxonomy. It's not to say that those types of learning experiences aren't important, just that it's not included for the taxonomy purposes. And the last thing I want to say is that the taxonomy is aimed at a course level. So I'm not looking at, one specific class is blended or hybrid. It's the entire course is blended. And at the same time, it's not that an entire program of instruction is blended or hybrid. I'm just looking at the class level for now. All right, so the first dimension that was included in the taxonomy is delivery medium, how students are receiving instruction. So this is a spectrum. So on this end of the spectrum, we have instruction that's entirely delivered from the instructor. So a classic example of this would be a lecture course where students come into class and all of the instruction they receive is from the instructor in that class. And then on the other end, the opposite of that would be an entirely online course where the student and the instructor never physically meet and all of the instruction students receive is delivered through technology. And so like I said, this is a spectrum. So it can be 100% on this side, 100% on that side, or somewhere in the middle. So if you had a calculus course where you watched lectures online that covered the principles or formulas or basic knowledge that you needed to know, and then you went to class and watched the instructor work through examples and you could ask questions while the instructor was working through those examples, then it would fall more in the middle of this dimension. The next type of dimension is instruction type. So again, this is a spectrum. And on this side, we have students are only receiving instruction while they're receiving content. So again, a classic example of this would be a lecture course where students go to class and they receive content and that's the only instruction that they get. Sure.
So, delivery by instructor means face-to-face.
Right.
Delivery by technology, you mean delivery by an instructor using technology as medium. Continuum goes farther out, right? I mean, there are online just making the point that I think sometimes things get lumped together. Your technology, delivery by technology can be delivery by instructor, using technology as a medium. Or it can be delivery where there's no human being involved at all. It's just a static text.
Right, so the question is sort of delivery from technology. Does it include delivery from an instructor as well as delivery from some sort of, program that delivers instruction, like Khan Academy or something like that, right?
Well, no. So we do annual ethics review. So it's a horrible online experience that doesn't involve human being at all. And a lot of what passes for technology delivered education is of that kind. I just want to make sure that we're not lumping together those two.
So, well, I would lump together those two things, whether it's delivery from an instructor that's delivered online. So for example, you can have delivery from an instructor in a face-to-face environment, like you said. And then if you were to record that lecture and the students were then to watch it online, I would classify that as delivery via technology, because even though the content is exactly the same, the instructional experience of watching that content is likely different. So in the face-to-face environment, you could ask questions, and in the technology-delivered environment, you could pause if you needed a break or something like that. And if there is no instructor, it's just sort of, I think I know what you're talking about. It's sort of like the professional training, typical course where it's just going through a slide.
Sometimes at universities with high price tags, that's what counts as
So one of your rules was that it was delivered by an instructor, so I don't see.
Well, so the delivery from instructor implies that it's a face-to-face environment like this is. And delivery from technology, it can still be the instructor providing the information, but now the student's receiving it through a different medium than a face-to-face class. Do you have another question?
So just to clarify along the same lines here, so if this was a video teleconference, and there were people in Korea watching simultaneously, which side would that be on?
So the question is, if this were a video conference, then where would it fall? So yes, right now we're doing delivery from, well, if you want to call me an instructor, so we're doing the face-to-face. But if we're doing this exact same talk, but through a video conference broadcast somewhere else, then that would be considered delivery via technology. Any other questions? All right. So instruction type. So the students are either receiving instruction, or the only instruction that receive is entirely content, like a didactic lecture. And so if that were the only type of instruction students got, then it would fall completely on this side of this dimension. And then the other side of the dimension is receiving feedback or guidance while students are applying content. So if they have a discussion and the student or the instructor is moderating that discussion, or they're working on problem sets and they're asking questions of the instructor, their instructor's providing feedback, then that would be applying content. In the middle of this taxonomy, a good example is your typical science course, where you have 3 hours of lecture, where you're just receiving content, and then 3 hours of lab, where you're doing lab procedures with an instructor provide feedback. All right, so these two dimensions can be used independently to form the structure of the taxonomy. So we use the delivery medium vertically with delivery from instructor. So if the instruction is entirely face-to-face, then it goes on the top of the taxonomy. If it's entirely online, then it's at the bottom of the taxonomy. And instruction type is horizontal. So if students are only receiving instruction while they're receiving content, then it's on this far left of the taxonomy. And if it's while they're applying content, then it would be on the far right. So if you had a class that was entirely lecture-based, then students would be receiving instruction from the instructor, and receiving content. So it would fall in the top left corner of this class. If part of that class were then to incorporate in-class activities like problem sets or discussion, then it would move along this top edge more towards applying content, but they're still only receiving it from the instructor. If instead half of the lectures were put online instead of live in-class lectures, then it would run along the left side of the taxonomy. So that's how the taxonomy is used, is each class can be sort of put a pin anywhere in the taxonomy that it falls. All right, so these 4 quadrants form the fundamental learning experiences. So instruction can be delivered from the instructor while receiving content. I'd call that instructor transmitted. And so an example of that is your traditional lecture-based course. If instead those lectures were delivered online, then it would be technology transmitted because students are still receiving content, but now they're receiving it from technology. Next is instructor mediated. So this is instruction that's delivered from technology, but while the students are applying content. And then the last one is technology mediated. So students are applying content, but now they're receiving feedback either in a discussion forum while the instructor moderates the discussion forum, or from some sort of tutoring system where they're receiving online feedback. And so if a course were to use only one of these types of fundamental instructional experiences, they would fall at the outer corners of the taxonomy. But that's not the type of courses that we're interested in, right? So that brings us to our first definition that we're interested in, which is hybrid. So when courses mix a substantial amount of these fundamental instructional experiences, they start to be called paired instructional experiences. So the first one is hybrid. And so in the literature, the way hybrid's been used most commonly is to describe a course that's part face-to-face and part online. So that's how I used it here. So a lecture hybrid is a course that only or mostly delivers content, but it's part from an instructor and part online. And then a practice hybrid is a course that mostly applies content, but it's part from an instructor and part online. So an example of a practice hybrid would be a discussion-based course that then continued that discussion in an online forum that the instructor moderated. The other type of paired instructional experience is a combination class. So to my knowledge, there's not a common term that describes classes in which students both receive and apply content with instructor feedback. So I use the term combination. And if they're only receiving this directly from an instructor in a face-to-face class, then it's a face-to-face combination. And the opposite of that is an online combination, where they're only receiving it online. So an example of an online combination would be a MOOC, where students are receiving all of their content online, and all of the feedback that they get from applying content is online too. And then in the middle of the taxonomy, we have the blends. So blends have a significant amount of delivery from instructor, delivery from technology, or instruction while receiving content, and instruction while applying content. And there's 3 main types of blends. The first that most people are familiar with is a flipped class. And so that's where you receive the content online, and then you apply the content in a face-to-face class. The next is a supplemental class. So supplemental class used to be a lecture-based class, and then they supplemented it with this online component, usually a discussion forum that the instructor moderated. And so now it's become a blended class because the students are receiving feedback while applying content. And the last one is a replacement blend. So replacement blends used to be a face-to-face combination course that students received and applied content with feedback from the instructor, and they replaced half of that with online content. So if you had a class that had lectures and discussions, it used to be that this all took place in class, but now half the lectures were put online, and now half of the discussions take place in an online forum. All right, so those are the components of the mixed taxonomy. And so for this group, we're mostly interested in this middle section because we're interested in courses that are part face-to-face and part online. And so to review the terms really quickly, the hybrids are at the outer edges of the taxonomy, but they're part face-to-face and part online. And the blends are in the middle of the taxonomy, so they blend all of these different types of instructional methods. Flipped are courses that have online content and in-person application. Supplemental are courses that have online or face-to-face content and online application. And then replacement is a mixture of all four of those fundamentals. All right, so that's the hard part of the talk to get through, is introducing all of these new terms. So now that we have these terms and they're defined consistently, what can they tell us about the literature that's already out there and the instructional methods that are being used and how that affects students' learning? So that's the question I set out to answer. And so I looked through all the literature, well, most of the literature, and there's a lot of it. And I looked at keywords hybrid, blended, flipped, and inverted. So you might notice that inverted wasn't included in the taxonomy, and that's because inverted is the engineer's term for flipped. So flipped was more commonly used, so I just decided to stick with flipped. And so I looked through the journals from 2000, when these courses started to become popular, to now, well, a few months ago. And I looked at the sort of journals that would usually publish this type of research, like Computers in Education. And I also looked through the main education databases and Google Scholars using these keywords. And I wanted to look at how these mixed methods affected learning. So I only included quasi-experimental research. And this research had to include a control group that was the traditionally taught version of the class. It had to measure quantitative learning outcomes. So there was usually a grade, like exam grades, project grades, or the overall course grade. And I only looked at higher education courses that were for credit. And to include all of these criteria, I only found 32 courses that match all of these criteria. And so while there is a lot of research on these sorts of courses, a lot of them are qualitative. They only ask the students, do you think this affected learning? Or they ask the instructor, do you think this affected learning? It doesn't actually measure the learning outcomes. All right, so if you look at courses that were reported as hybrid in the literature, and you reclassify them based on the categories of the taxonomy, so it's not really important that you remember exactly what each of these terms means. It's not even really important that, replacement blend has 4 courses that were recategorized, or flip blend has 1. The important thing to take from this slide is that courses that were called hybrid, of the 14 courses, they fit into all of these different types of courses. So this highlights the inconsistency that was in the literature and why the findings are not consistent.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Were you looking at the people who wrote these?
Yes.
What disciplines are they coming from? Because that could explain the inconsistency.
Right. So the question is, what disciplines do these people come from? And it's all over. So I told you I looked at journals that were the usual suspects for using hybrid, blended, or flipped studies. But most of the journals that I actually ended up using were domain-specific education journals, so the Journal of Accounting Education or something like that. And so the methods and the statistical analyses and all of the researchy type things were very different across a lot of the different studies, which, sort of highlights the problem. All right, and so I did the same thing with blended. So I looked at courses that were reported as blended and reclassified them based on the categories of the taxonomy. And of 9 courses, they're represented in 6 different types of courses. So again, this just sort of highlights the inconsistency that was out there. Flipped and inverted was actually very consistent. So the only complaint I have about flipped and inverted is that one of the courses that called itself flipped also included an in-class lecture component, and that's going to be important later, so just giving you a primer. All right, so if we look at how are the learning outcomes between traditionally taught courses and the new mixed method courses. So let me just walk you through this graph a little bit. So on the x-axis, we have the different types of courses defined by the taxonomy. On the y-axis, we have number of courses that are represented. And the dark lines are courses that improved learning outcomes, and the lighter lines are courses that found equivalent learning outcomes between the traditionally taught and mixed method course. And so if we use these classifications, we start to see some trends. So if we're only looking at the hybrids and blends, lecture hybrid, most of the courses found equivalent learning outcomes, and one of them did not. Replacement blend is the same story. Most of them found equivalent learning outcomes, and one of them did not. And then flipped is the opposite. Most of the flips, or the vast majority, found improved learning outcomes, and one of them did not. And then for the practice hybrid and the supplemental blends, we're not seeing any trends here. But so it's not enough just to say, you know, flipped blends improve learning. You want to know why flipped blends improve learning. So I started looking at the differences between the traditionally taught courses and the mixed method courses to look at why these differences are occurring. And so there are 13 courses that only changed the delivery medium. They only moved instruction online. Most of these courses had equivalent learning outcomes. And this is a little bit surprising because there is some evidence that suggests asynchronous online learning can be better than face-to-face learning for a number of reasons. But this is also encouraging because it means that these courses moved instruction online and it didn't negatively impact learning. So that's important to know. But it also ties into this time in class. So half of the courses that we looked at reduced the time that students spent in class by moving this instruction online. And most of these courses didn't hurt learning. They found equivalent learning outcomes. So we can put class online, reduce the amount of class spent in physical classrooms, and not noticeably affect learning outcomes. On the other side of that, the half of the courses that maintain class time, most of those improved learning outcome. So this means that class time is valuable for improving learning outcomes. And it's not entirely clear just based on this review exactly why, but I think it has to do with the next bullet, which is that courses that added feedback while students were applying content, so for example, while students were solving problems, most of those courses improved learning outcomes. And this is really interesting because it's not that these courses previously had no content application, that you went to a math course and you were never asked to solve a math problem. It's that when the instructor or some sort of program was available to provide you feedback while you were doing those math problems, suddenly we see improved learning outcomes. And so 11 courses added feedback in class, and most of these improved learning outcomes. The one course that didn't see improved learning outcomes was the course that had, the flipped class that had an in-class lecture component. So this in-class lecture component was the first 15-20 minutes of the course that reviewed the content that students were supposed to see online. And there wasn't really any data in the paper to explain this result, but I think if students are given this review lecture at the beginning of class, yeah, what reason do they have to watch the videos before class? They think they're being well prepared. But really, they weren't prepared to apply the content in this class. So I think that explains the one outlier there. If we look at classes that added feedback online, half of them improved learning outcomes. And the courses that did improve learning outcomes, they either were continuing an in-class application, so they started a discussion in class, they continued it online, or they started working on problems while the instructor was there to provide feedback, and then they continued solving those problems online. And half of them didn't affect learning. So the courses that didn't affect learning, some of them, they already had in-class application of feedback. They were just, in the traditionally taught version of the course, they were just adding more feedback online. So it wasn't that the instructional methods were really changing that much. They were just adding an additional resource. And then the last one, which I think is the most interesting one, is courses that added or asked students to solve problems in sort of a novel way while they received feedback online, didn't improve learning outcomes. So this didn't improve, or getting the online feedback didn't improve learning over just solving the homework problems by themselves at home. And so this is really interesting because these problem-solving tasks that weren't helped in the online feedback were helped when they had in-class feedback. And so there's something missing from these online feedback providers that the instructors are providing, and it's not being captured. And I wish I could tell you what that was, but I don't know yet. I'm working on it.
That reminds me of the findings of Jan Schofield with John Anderson's algebra tutor, that when she did her qualitative study of students using the online tutor system, they were very happy to use the online tutor system until they hit a snag. And then they hated getting the feedback online. They wanted face-to-face feedback, and that was a pretty significant finding from her study, actually.
Right, so the plug and chug application where you're applying the procedure the exact same way each time, all you really need is something to tell you, yeah, you got that right, or no, you got it wrong. But if you're having to extrapolate from the lecture and make connections that weren't made apparent, then it can be very beneficial to have this sort of dynamic interaction with the thing that's providing you feedback. Yes?
So one thing that I'm not hearing from you that you looked at was sort of scale of the class, the numbers of students in the class. So did you look at that at all, or
All right.
see whether it made a difference?
Yeah, so we didn't, well, I tried to look at scale of the class, number of the class. I tried to look at a number of different things. How much peers were interacting in classes, the group size of peers, all of these things that the research suggests makes a difference in mixed method classes. But because these studies are coming from very different sources and very different people, they're not always reported. And so there were a few studies that had really extensive regressions. We collected data on all of these things, and we think it makes, this much of the variance is due to the students being upper level students or being lower level students. But that was only a few of them, so I couldn't really add to that discussion. But, so in the paper version of this, I have a list of things that you should include when you're reporting on this data. So.
Online feedback?
Yeah.
Was it just the rote, yes, this is why, no, or was there any kind of a smart adaptive learning where it could do some branching?
So, yeah.
Support the students in the learning?
Right, so the question is the online feedback adaptive or intelligent, or is it just, yes, you got that right, or no, you got that wrong? For these courses, so there's really, not that many courses that fall in this one little category. And they didn't use any sort of adaptive program. It was just, yes, you got this right, here's why, no, you got this wrong, here's why. It didn't conform to the learner at all. And so I'm not saying that technology can't provide feedback that would help students do this. It's just that that's not the norm of what's being used right now. And I know there are people working on those sorts of adaptive systems. All right, so in conclusion, the mixed method courses, either improved learning outcomes or they can reduce the time that's necessary to spend in class. And so which one of these goals you're trying for really depends on the instructor and whether the instructor is comfortable with mixed methods, the students and what the students' goals in the class are, the course, so if it's a bottleneck course and we just need to reach more students, maybe it's better that we reduce time in class rather than improve learning outcomes. It also depends on the institutional goals. And some future directions for this research are I really want to explore this lectures and flipped classrooms question because we only found one example that sort of prompted this hypothesis. So I'd like to do some more research on that and also include additional dimensions in the taxonomy. So like adding synchronicity back into the taxonomy as a way to further explore differences between classes. And I'd like to thank C21U for supporting me through this research. And I'd also like to thank Mike McCracken, David Majerick, Richard Katrenbone, and Keith Bujak for their feedback that they gave me throughout this process. I'd also like to thank you for coming and listening. All right, let's see what.
I would assume one of the difficulties of trying to continue this research is that you're not controlling the experiment.
Right. That.
Some faculty member's doing something and they may be doing it goofy or doesn't fit in a box or something. You're kind of stuck.
Right. I had no control over the research, right, that came out or right in the future, which is why in the paper version of this research I list out, please include these things. It would be really helpful to comparing different types of courses and different factors.
Plus, it's hard with most education research. It's quasi-experimental
Right.
in general.
Yeah, if you're looking at courses that are in a classroom, you can't randomly assign people to classrooms, so it has to be quasi-experimental research. Yes?
Where's the paper version? Is that available for everyone or just for GT?
So it's not available quite yet, but in the next month or so, it should be. We have an old version of the taxonomy that's on the C21U website right now, and it's basically the same categories. They just have slightly different names before they were tweaked. But all of the analyses results aren't included in that paper yet. But if you're interested in getting an advanced copy of the paper, you can contact me. Yes?
You had mentioned early on that you excluded anything that was qualitative because you said that it was only measuring perception, and I'm wondering if that's, is that really the state of the qualitative research? Is there anything more sophisticated where they, looked at student work and did sort of more detailed qualitative analysis on actual work to get at student learning outcomes?
Right, so the question's about qualitative research and the data that's out there. So there are lots of meta-analyses even and reviews of the qualitative data for flipped classes that measure anything from perception of the instructors or students thinking how much they learned, their satisfaction with the course, their motivation in the course, not trivial things. But what was missing was this quantitative sort of look at the learning outcomes. And so that's the part I focused on, but if you're interested in those sorts of factors, I can certainly point you to some really good papers. Yes?
In your conclusion slide, you talked about improved learning outcomes or reduced time in class. Should it be an and?
Not based on the current data. So if courses reduce time in class, then most of the time they don't improve learning outcomes. They just see equivalent learning outcomes. But if courses maintain the time in class and add this feedback component, then that's when we see the improved learning outcomes. So the time in class is important to the component that makes the improved learning outcomes happen.
So based upon papers that are out there so far.
Right. Yes?
Any clues to the three that didn't improve learning outcomes that still maintain time?
I would have, so the question is if there's any clues about these 3 that maintain and climb in class but didn't improve learning outcomes. I would have to check and make sure, but I'm pretty sure that those are the courses that were the replacement blends. So they used to be in class, receiving content and applying content, and they just moved part of it online. So now they're just receiving more, sort of less concise instruction. And so the actual change in the course wasn't that different, and which is why it's not affecting the learning.
That's an issue for all this analysis kind of cutting across in those 32. Because no one's controlling for pedagogy.
Right.
You have no idea whether or not the online delivery piece was specifically designed to utilize the technology. The metadata is so strong that meta-analyses are so strong that formative assessment kind of dominates everything else. That when you see something that looks like formative assessment, where there's a big gap in the delivery mechanism, you have to ask yourself, so what is it in that delivery mechanism that washes out this huge effect? And that just seems to me to be hard to do you're looking through the wrong end of the telescope.
Right.
Trying to look back and see what happened. Going forward, because we have these kinds of labs, we can kind of keep track of that. But it's hard for me to draw any firm conclusions.
Right. So it's not generally controlled, and it's not generally reported. And so we do need these sort of on, my end, I want to do these experimental or quasi-experimental research that says, all right, these data suggest that this might be happening. Now let's, from a priori standpoint, go and test that. I mean, that's, we can't explain everything ad hoc and then really say that this is definitely what's happening, right? Yes?
Do you find any difference in the level of thinking of Bloom's taxonomy in terms of learning outcomes? Because you think for the lower level, maybe it would make no difference if there was added application time for the higher levels.
Right, so the question is if we saw any differences on Bloom's taxonomy, whether it was at this sort of understand knowledge level or at the application or higher level. And so I did look at that, and most of the studies included that information, so what level of Bloom's they were measuring. And we find that a lot of the courses that say they have equivalent learning outcomes, they only measured at this sort of understanding knowledge level of Bloom. So there might be differences in application, it's just that they weren't measured. And also the flipped classes that are supposed to help students apply content much better, a lot of them found differences in their project components of their courses. So students performed much better on the projects that they were given, but they performed same on the exams that only measured at this knowledge or understanding. So taking that instruction out of the classroom, those lectures out of the classroom, didn't hurt their understanding of this basic foundational knowledge, but it did help them apply that knowledge better.
That's not different than findings on problem-based learning, that post intervention assessment will demonstrate knowledge difference between problem-based learning and traditional. But when they go back 6 months later and ask students about that content, problem-based learning has a much better sticking power. So you probably want to look at that as well.
Right.
One thing I was thinking about, I have a couple of questions. You didn't say anything about the kinds of courses that this is happening, first of all. And then secondly, were some of these like core requirements, like intro biology that were, sorry, I had to go there. Where, I mean, they're just getting through it. I'm just curious. I mean, is anyone, or is this like apples and oranges all over the place?
Right, so I looked at the domain of the course that was being evaluated. All of the courses at least reported, whether it was business or healthcare or science. They might have not provided much more details than that, but so I can at least differentiate them into domains, and I looked across the different domains, and it doesn't seem that that's a driving factor in those results. It's really the change in the instructional methods that's driving the results. And sorry, remind me of the second part of your question?
Intro courses.
Intro courses.
Courses that they're just checking the box.
Right. So whether the course is required, elective, for majors, for non-majors, those are all things that are on my wish list, things I wish people would report, but they didn't. Yes?
What about for a humanities class, there's an assigned reading, and then maybe the professor might have a short intro lecture. Where would you classify that, and do you see much research?
So that's a common thing that people sort of get confused about is they say, well, humanities class students, you know, they get the content before coming to class and then they apply it through a discussion in class. And so people want to call that a flipped blend. But I would say because students aren't getting any instruction while they're reading a literary book that's, you know, it's not intended for instructional purposes. It's intended as art. So that students who are reading that book without any feedback from the instructor, that would not be considered a flipped class. However, if, like you said, the professor provided some sort of introduction, look for these themes, look for, you know, these devices, then that would guide the students to how they're supposed to be interpreting this information, and that could be considered a flipped class. Yes?
Hi, Lauren. Could you tell me if any of the studies ascertained the students' perceptions about that learning environment they were exposed to? I think of the term transactional distance, you know, where you're face-to-face with the teacher, close, but then when you're taking an online course, what psychological factors affect the learning when you don't see the instructor?
Right, so some of these courses, actually very few, included a qualitative component too. So they asked students about, you know, what their experience was like in the course and how motivated they were and how they felt about different components of the course. And I didn't get too much in depth in that data because that's, you know, sort of not what I was looking at, but it seems that students are very resistant to change. They've learned how to take a traditionally taught class and how to succeed in it well. And so they're very resistant at the beginning to any sort of change. But then once they see the value of the course, that, oh, I'm actually learning way better than I did in a traditionally taught version of the course, or maybe I'm not seeing my instructor, but I know that, you know, I'll see them on Monday, or I can still email them, I still have this relationship with them, that they end up liking the mixed method courses better because it improves their learning outcome or, you know, has one of these other benefits. Yes?
In your future research, when you look at the effect that a mini lecture has, I would encourage you to not just to look at whether there was one present, but really what it did and when. Because in my class, I call it a low-tech immersion, right? So I teach international affairs, and I do the guided reading ahead of time, and then they come into class and they have to report out and do activities that really are applying the reading. Then after they go through that, then I do a mini lecture. And the reason I started doing that is because they weren't feeling like they were learning, because it was fun and engaging. I had to kind of recap what we had learned and then address some misconceptions. And I found that the feedback I got was very positive on that. And so if I just came in and told them what they had read, then I could see they didn't really do the reading right, but they were doing the reading in this context.
Right. And so to your point, I'm not trying to say that, you know, in-class lectures in, you know, application-based classes aren't a good thing. Because, well, I know Don Webster, you know, if students get stuck on something and it seems like, you know, I can knock out a lot more, this is sort of bad to say, but a lot more birds with one stone by stopping, giving a short lecture that clarifies this point that people are having problems with. That's a good thing, I would think. I mean, I don't have any data for that. But I think because it was a summative lecture at the beginning of class, that's why it wasn't effective. But a summative lecture at the end of class to tie everything back together, I mean, I could also see that being very beneficial to learning.
Did you also look at course design to see if there was a good in and out connection between the online content versus the in-class, that has a huge impact on.
Right. So
If you have a whole bunch of online content you don't actually address in class, then it's poorly designed.
right. So yeah, when you don't connect in class and online content, that's sort of a recipe for disaster. So a lot of these courses didn't necessarily report that sort of thing, but the people who do these sorts of studies, they're really trying to improve learning. And so they usually have their pedagogy down pretty well. And so most of the courses, from what I could tell, they integrated the online and in-class components, which is, other research suggests is very critical for success of these sorts of classes.
Just experience teaching however they design a hybrid course. My first couple times they do it, it's usually, that's the hardest part for them, is to actually design it so that the in and out connects well.
Right. Yes?
Now, how concerned are you about bias in both publications? So people tend to publish, results that are positive, and also, sort of confirmation bias that people, find generally what they're looking for.
Right. So with publication bias, that is sort of a concern because if you noticed, all of the courses that were reported had at least equivalent learning outcomes. I would venture to say that that's not always true. And I don't think that would be a leap. But, based on the research that's available, that's sort of what we're faced with. And for confirmation bias, I think it's encouraging that people are reporting courses that have equivalent learning outcomes, even if they weren't looking for equivalent learning outcomes. So there still might be that confirmation bias of I wanted to see some sort of improvement and I didn't, but at least we see some courses, or half of the courses had equivalent learning outcomes. So it seems that we're out of time. Yeah, we have 5 minutes left.
So one interesting outcome of this would be experimental methodology. So how do you take this and kind of write a researcher manual for being able to write a research result that fairly represented the effectiveness?
So that's, so one of my future directions here was this lectures in flipped classrooms. How does a lecture in a flipped classroom affect the learning? And so it's really hard to do a true experimental research program because you want it to be as ecologically valid as possible. But if we could look at classrooms that varied on the type of lecture that they were giving or varied on when they gave the lecture, so those would be two independent variables that might be of interest. And if we can go in a priori and say, I think this is going to affect learning in this way and it's going to not affect learning in this way or something like that, then we can go through and see if it's actually affecting learning in those
I was
ways.
thinking about being a little more proactive. I mean, it's a field that's plagued with questionable write-ups of experiments. Maybe you can write something that says, unless you're willing to do these things, don't bother to write about it.
Oh, sort of like a guide for potential research. Yeah. Well, I think that's just David's job.
I'd like to turn to you, Lauren.
Great. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Do we know what the next talk is?
So the next talk will be the president of Ithaca, Kevin Guthrie. And so Ithaca is a company that does digital cataloging of information sorted. So they're the people responsible for JSTOR or those sorts of databases. And so he's going to come and talk to us about how we can catalog our content.
Also policy studies on higher ed. The founder is Louise Bowen, former president of Princeton and economist. We're going to have a screening of the Ivory Tower. Do we know when?
Yeah, soon.
So Ivory Tower is a current film that talks about some of these issues. And stay tuned to see when that's going to.
All right, thank you for coming.